I have spent now decades engaging in deep, deep personal work to understand the socialization, the internalization of being a white-bodied woman who is about to turn 50, of Jewish ancestry, of growing up with class privilege, of being cisgendered, of having varying, disabilities that are invisible, right? And so really exploring how that has shaped and informed who I am, how I experience the world, how I make meaning of it all, right? So there's been a long personal journey. And then there's been a journey that I am so grateful that I've been able to be in deep, deep partnership with Black, Indigenous people of color and extremely culturally diverse communities to engage in this work at a systemic level, right, at an institutional level. So I'm blessed to be a lead associate with the Racing to Equity Consulting Group. I'm also a lead associate and liberation coach with the Hooks Global Consulting Group. Hooks Global is a Black-owned business. Racing to Equity is a Latinx-owned consulting business where our primary focus is supporting institutions across all sectors on a global scale to support one's efforts in truly becoming a racially just, a socially just institution that is backed up by policy and you could feel it in its culture, right? You could walk into a room and you could just feel the difference in what's transpired. So I put together a slide deck and the slides just really represent my learnings over an extended period of time that I'm hoping will do a bit of framing. When Deanna and I spoke, and I really appreciated creating an opportunity and space for people to ask the questions, why are we talking about this? Why is it important? What, and really allowing, if there are questions you've been sitting with, if there are, things that you're wanting deeper understanding around our explanation, my hope is that collectively, I'll do my best to respond, but that collectively, when folks leave here, some of those questions you maybe have been holding, you'll feel a little bit more grounded in the knowing of what those answers are with that. The other piece is that, we have to recognize that I am a white-bodied person having a white-bodied experience, a white-bodied reality, right? That has afforded me a tremendous amount of power and privilege, regardless of other aspects of my identity that may be subjugated or have been marginalized or oppressed in other ways, historically and present day. And so that's the context that I'm talking about. That's really, my framing, my knowing. And so with that, again, really grateful to be here. I'll just also share, I'm a white, cisgender, Jewish, relatively fully able-bodied mom of a beautiful 2-year-old that I am a mom through adoption. And also to name that my son, who is of Mexican ethnic origins, who will grow up racialized as brown. And so a whole dynamic of what does it mean to be a mom of a child of color. And so those are, I would say, some of the identities that are really central to who I am and that I bring here today. So we can go to the next slide. And I'm going to ask before, one of the things that I am deeply committed to is around when we engage in this work, it is not just an intellectual exercise. One of the, I would say, dominant cultural norms that exists in the US is we really lift up and prioritize and elevate intellect rather than like feeling body. And I really believe that we have more than one brain, but we kind of center, the brain that resides in the head sort of above the neck and up in terms of our learning, our knowing, our experiences. And so my commitment is really about how do we engage in this work from a whole body approach? How do I feel into what I'm experiencing? How do I kind of listen into what my body might be telling me so that I'm not just immediately reacting and responding from first thought in the brain? That is usually an automatic response, often an unconscious response, and that's coming from a reaction that's happening in the body and the body signaling the brain, and then we speak from that place. And so I also know that for many, you've already had half a day of your day complete. And so this gives us an opportunity to collectively come together, to take a moment just to pause, to center, to ground, to come into this moment, right? So we can be in our full humanity and we can sort of put pause on all that is, know that it will be coming back to us in just a moment. And so because we have such a short amount of time, my partners and I, we usually take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to ground together using varying centering exercises, mindfulness exercises. And I'm just going to ask folks right now to do a couple of things. If you are, typing away at emails or whatever it may be, and your screen's off and you're engaging in something else other than eating, please continue to eat. Just go ahead for a moment and pause. Just stop. If you're on your phone or you're looking at your phone or you're scrolling through, put it to the side, pause, just stop. So if there's any other thing that's distracting, take a couple of moments, put it to the side, pause, and I'm going to ask people at their own pace, at their own time. I'm going to do it as well, as we will take 3 collective deep breaths. And so breathing into the nose and out through the nose, or out through the mouth if that feels better, to just kind of release and drop into the body, as a way for us to ground and come together in our full humanity and shift from all that we've been engaging in to now having intentional time and space to engage in conversation and an experience that is critical to the humanity and survival of Black, Indigenous people of color, and for all of us that are here today. And so I'm going to just give a moment. I'm going to breathe with you, and then we'll jump in. Thank you. And I hope you really did take a time for yourself. One of the things about the inequitable structures that we see in the context of the United States is we operate from a place of urgency. The constant go, 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 do, produce, produce, produce. We're always running from one thing to another, which I actually think is quite dehumanizing, and doesn't allow for the health and well-being of ourselves. And so I always appreciate when there's that collective pause. So we can go to the next slide. We can go to the one after this too, because I did a little introduction. Yeah, so we're going to pause on this slide for a moment. I don't identify as a historian. I wish I had the brain of a historian. I wish I could roll facts off my tongue. That is not me. That will never be me. And yet I have been working really hard to try and understand the history in the context of the United States. And I'm speaking very specifically in the context of the United States, where I know in my schooling years through elementary into middle into high school, that a lot of what was taught to me was either inaccurate, partial, or completely untrue altogether. I know growing up in New York, on the lands of Lenape and Wappinger peoples, that I was, I believe, sort of indoctrinated in my educational experience to believe that Native communities indigenous to this land were extinct. And when I eventually moved west and was immersed in very deep and personal and intentional relationship with Indigenous communities, did I really begin to understand the incorrect, inaccurate, and altogether false narrative that I was taught in my early years. And so what we're looking at this map, again, this I always think of my mentor, one of my mentors, one of the founders of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, that offer the Undoing Racism workshop. I can't encourage folks enough to attend one of them, and it's great because now they're so accessible because they've become virtual. And he always says the only way to undo something is to know how it was done or what was done. And so when I look at this slide, that sort of grayed out area, that's sort of the original 13 colonies. And the blue represents what was originally all indigenous land, native land, indigenous to the United States. And what you see here, and we know is deeply embedded in our history, is a theft and an extraction of resources and land for the benefit and gain of an exclusive group of people. And so as the blue kind of fades away, what we begin to see, and it's like a split second, it's hard to catch, is what actually exists today that is considered, we call it reservations, but that is land specifically designated for tribal communities, for Native communities in the United States. And so I want to pause for a moment and let folks sort of take in this visual. I know for me, I'm a visual learner. It helps tremendously for me to digest something. And Deanna, if we go to the next slide, this is what's very hard to see in that blink, but this is what remains today. You'll notice a lot of it is landlocked land, so not near water. And these are giving communities that water is essential to survival. Water is sacred. And so I want to take a moment, and this is where I'm going to ask everyone in the room is welcome in the chat room, just to maybe put a word or two or a sentence or two around what these slides mean to you, what's coming up for you, what do you notice? And if you also want to acknowledge lands that you're on, I'm coming today from the unceded territories of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne peoples in Colorado. So taking a moment in the chat room, if folks want to express just seeing these, how it makes you feel, or what thoughts come up in relationship to this, why would slides like this, as we're engaging in a conversation around why, would be important as some of the context setting. Parallels to Israel, Palestine, yes. And that's real right now. Thank you, Peter. I always appreciate resource sharing. Yep. Yes, pain and suffering. Yep. Yes, Jenny, yes. April, beautiful. Yeah, how are we really reaching and ensuring all communities have access to this beloved institution? Yes, Steve, absolutely. This idea of manifest destiny. Right, Tiara? Yep, especially with what's coming up in this month. Broken promises over and over again, yes. The number of treaties that were signed but never respected and ratified, and great, so you can keep the comments coming, but again, just grounding us in some of our history. Again, I'm anything but a historian, but I appreciate slides like this that allow me to sort of ground in even a visual understanding and perspective of what has taken place in this country and what this country was founded off of. Yes, what does it mean to this generation? Absolutely. All right, so we can go to the next slide. And we'll share, you all can have access to these land slides. We'll make sure that you get the 2 slides. And so this next slide, I put it here and I talk about history, legacy, and structure. One of the, oh yes, I love April, thank you, and others for resource sharing. Please do that, because that's one of the beauties of the chat room is we have instant resource sharing opportunity. And so thinking about, again, in the context of the United States, what truly is our history? Our history is grounded in the enslavement of African peoples who were brought here. It's about attempted genocide. It's about theft and stolen land, right? And there's nothing post. It may look different than what was, right? But we're still seeing today over time where we went through enslavement, segregation, and the way we continue to see mass incarceration, and an understanding that each one of our institutions, education being one of them, was built off of, right, this history, this legacy, to create a structure that would ensure that people who looked like me, right, maybe weren't ethnically or our origins weren't necessarily from the same place, but basically that looked like me, that were white-bodied, right, a specific given group of people, would ensure power, right, and political and economic gain at the expense of everyone else. And so understanding, when we even think about education as a whole, right, when I think about who was education first founded for, education was founded for white Christian men, right? And so knowing that each one of our institutions was built off of what we call a system of oppression, the intention that we are going to ensure a given group of people, eventually white-bodied people, legitimate access, sanctioned by the state, backed up by law, backed up as we continue to see in policies, practice, and procedures to ensure access, upward mobility, greater power and control over, literally even to dictate the narratives that we hear, right, over Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then we add on other marginalized identities, right, because we want to acknowledge the intersection of that. And so a huge part of why we have to be engaging in conversations, I would say, around equity, racial equity, because diversity and inclusion is a byproduct when we are truly an equitable institution and organization. So I always say, like, not necessarily in the business of diversity and inclusion, I'm really about how do we create more equitable systems and structures? How do we create humanizing institutions where particularly Black, Indigenous, people of color are valued, honored, and dignified, right? And so that's more, and knowing that diversity will naturally happen, and that if people are truly feeling honored, valued, and dignified, then that must mean that there is a liberatory, inclusive space for people's whole full self to come up and be present. And so a huge part of this, why we have to talk about it, is that because we are not post anything. Things may look different, but we are still seeing forms of, enslavement, mass murdering, theft and stealing of, power over, and we continue to see it again and again and again. And the people most impacted by this are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so knowing our history, and particularly to my white-bodied folks who are here, I can say for myself, I know that I am a third, fourth generation born. So not too many generations here, but long enough. My family coming from Russia and Poland through Ellis Island, escaping their own hardship and war and attempted genocide, and came to this country. And I know that there was very quickly, although they might not have been able to articulate it, they made a conscious choice to give up many aspects of our Jewish identity in order to become white, because white meant greater access and upward mobility. And so then my family became complicit with a structure, with a system that was designed to ensure that people who looked like us physically would benefit, while people of Black, Indigenous, or other ethnic racial identities outside of Eurocentric identities or European identities would remain oppressed, marginalized, mistreated, not have the same level of access and upward mobility that my people would have in this country. And so again, I think one of the things that is critical for us to be thinking about, it's something that I know for me, I work on a daily basis, whether that's my own personal individual learning or how I can learn collectively, is, do I know my own personal history and where my family came from? And for me as a white person, I have to ask the question, in what ways have I benefited? In what ways, I could certainly ask in my Jewish identity that there's been harm, but in what ways have I benefited? How have I been complicit to this, right? And then also really understanding and knowing the history, legacy, and the structure of systems of oppression in this country that are creating the ongoing outcomes that we're seeing in our communities. One of the things that I want to say, and if we go to the next slide, is that there is nothing inherently wrong with any aspect of any one identity. There is nothing inherently wrong with any aspect of anyone's identity. This is not about bashing and shaming and blaming white people, my people, right? However, what it is recognizing that my identity in relationship to a system of power has created unearned advantages, right, that allows me to benefit every day, that my fellow brothers, sisters, siblings who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color don't have that same lived experience. So for me, that's problematic. That's what I want to look at. And so I've moved through guilt and anger and shame and grief and all these things. And there were periods where I wanted nothing to do with white people and all that stuff because I didn't want to be associated, until I got really grounded in who I am, understood the history of race and racism and systems of oppression in this country, understanding that it's a system, that yes, we could all be bigoted, there are individual acts, but really it's about how could we be loving yet firm with people, but hard on the systems, right, that we're in. Because what we've now seen in the context of the United States is that we have used social identity, right? These are socially constructed identities, most of these, if not, I would say almost, if not all, right? Because someone had to name them or come up with a category. We've used socially constructed social identities to create a values-based system around who's worthy, who's not, who's better than, who's not, who's entitled to, who's not, who do I want to strive to be, who do I want to be anything but, who's going to have access and ease and flow in this lifetime, who's going to not, right? And so again, this is not, most of us probably in this Zoom room, in this circle, in this space right here, could probably straddle where some of us might hold more identities that would fall within dominant groups that hold and maintain greater power and privilege in the context of the United States, right? And there might be some in this room who hold mostly or more marginalized identities or oppressed identities, or we could say subjugated identities or targeted identities. There's a lot of language out there to describe these groupings. But it's a recognition that this country was founded on creating a system, a structural arrangement using racial classification as like the top one, but using social identities to legitimize and justify the stealing and extraction of land, the ongoing mass murdering, and a whole bunch of other stuff that we see in this country, right? And intentionally to create the divide that we continue to currently be in. And so we know that when we take a system of power and we marry that, infuse that with identities, what happens is it automatically will create what we're saying is a dominant grouping and a marginalized grouping, which then creates a system of oppression. So if we got white folks here, folks of color here, that's racism, right? When we start to break it up by gender and cisgendered, I identify anatomically as what I was born with, cisgendered, right? And then we have other genders, or in here it often gets lumped together, although it's distinctly different, but gender identity, sexual orientation, expression, right? We see sexism, right? Ableism, and ageism, and classism, and xenophobia, and homophobia. I mean, the list sort of goes on of the oppressions and phobias that we see. So part of the understanding of this is the system that's been created, how we've used socially constructed identities to create classifications, to create a value-based system of what's normal, what's right, what's good, as opposed to what would be abnormal, bad, we want to stay away from, something there's a deficit, needs to be fixed, right? So we have this whole structural arrangement. And then a deeper, what I believe, how I can really get clear on the why, is knowing, where do I fit within this structural arrangement? Where do I fall within this? In what ways have I maybe not thought about how I have benefited just simply because of the color of my skin, or the ways even in which I have been completely harmed or mistreated, where I've been telling myself this whole time, maybe something's wrong with me, and not really realizing, oh, wait a second, there was a whole system designed to ensure that I had this lived experience, right? So noticing, where do I fall within this? What does that mean for responsibility, accountability, and healing? Yes, absolutely. To characterize, Marcia, thank you for that framing. Absolutely. And I would add that it's not just historically, it's historically and present day. Who continues to, and there is so much data out there that shows us, and you could always, I mean, race is always the number one predictor, and then you got a whole bunch of other predictors of who truly, and we can frame it in the context of higher education. Who do we mostly seeing having access to institutions? And not only the access, but actually the ability to navigate, to afford, and to succeed in educational institutions, right? So these are a lot of understanding the why is becoming like an inquisitive, lover of questioning, right? It's like I have a 2.5-year-old, and I'm not fully there yet. So to my parents who are here, you can share some words of wisdom, but I feel like I'm about to move into the most beloved question: why? 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 And honestly, it is a sacred question. I do believe that in this country, we have done we, for folks who look like me, I don't ever actually really have to ask the question because I benefit from this system, right? But I do believe that we've sort of, we don't allow the why and the questioning to emerge enough, and particularly collectively. Um, so before we go on to the next slide, Marcia, thank you for, if I just want to pause for a moment, and if there's anybody else in the room that just wants to, you can raise your hand or go ahead and unmute. We're just going to take a few minutes because if you are holding questions, write them down, message them to Deanna, or hold them, in the chat room. We are going to pause in a little bit and get into some discussion. But I just want to pause here because this was a lot. And just open it up for some collective learning. If there's anyone who wants to express anything, share anything, or maybe offer some additional framing or contextualization that supports us understanding the why.
Well, can I ask a question? This is Ben.
Yes, yes.
I'm just curious, this graph about dominant groups, when I was growing up, is there anything similar to like dominant neighborhoods? Because, years ago, neighborhoods were based on color and everything else, ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Is there any relationship between the way the neighborhoods came up and these groups, or?
Absolutely, Ben. Beautiful question. And so we have a history. So Ben, if you like Google redlining mm-hmm. and they're going to get tons of resources, and look up what's gone on, in this country, but 100%. And so as people got pushed out, particularly, Indigenous community got pushed out, right? And we created reservations. We had communities, and honestly, the Irish, the Italian, the Jews originally were in that, but eventually my yes. people, we got to benefit and move into white. So we weren't as impacted, but you started to see, inner city areas, like subsections of cities where it would be densely populated and concentrated, where people were put into because there wasn't the opportunity for land ownership, to actually be considered a citizen, or right or access to those things. And so 100% when and Deanna, if you can help me remember, and if there's an email list, we could send some resources out for folks around this, because there is some really amazing, and if you even look online, you can do research even in your own neighborhood, because many of the neighborhoods we live in today, it's only very, very recently that some of the laws have changed, that once said no Blacks, no Mexicans, no Jews, no, mm-hmm. only in the past, decade or so has that even changed. And that's in some of the neighborhoods, we probably live in. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, April, bring it. April, Ben, just click on April, like on all the resources that are getting shared right now, that, and schools absolutely is a big piece of it in terms of, your zip code and the correlation between funding allocation. And so if you're in a certain zip code, which means, more affluent neighborhoods, which means more investment in the schools. And so you're going to have, I don't want to necessarily say that they're quote unquote better schools, but it's going to mean that you will have more, affluent school environments that are more resourced. Great, Marcia, thank you. Yeah. All right, so let's come to the next slide. And I think so to do also a little bit of framing, and as we, we're kind of grounding in, why do we need to be talking about this? Why is this important? What do I need to be thinking about as I, see as a person in this world who wants a just world where every human being can thrive regardless of any aspect of your identity. And so we know that this country was founded off of a race construct, that we've used social classification and categorization of socially constructed identities to create a values-based system to ensure that power, economic, political gain was concentrated within a given group of people, those people being white. So whites are really the exclusive beneficiaries of this structural arrangement. Remember when I said earlier, there is nothing inherently wrong with any aspect of any single identity, but when combined with a system of power, then we got some other conversations to have. And so things like racism and other forms of oppression that we see are operating and functioning at different levels. I would say it's cyclical in nature, often happening simultaneously. Some of these we have greater influence over, right? When we think about what is my sphere of influence, I know myself. Um, I have influence in, as a registered voter. I have influence in being a community organizer and some of the affiliations that I'm with to maybe look at policies, practices, and procedures. When I was in varying leadership roles in varying institutions, I had a level of influence to impact in terms of organizational culture, what happened in terms of funding allocation, how policies were formed, right? So I always have to contextualize where are those spheres of influence that I know I have access and reach to try to understand what this means for me. And so one of the ways that systems of oppression are playing out, racism, all of that is playing out, which is why we see the inequities we see, is what we call at the internalized level, right? So what's happening, I'll just share myself in this. I know that I received a lot of indirect messaging that had me believe or internalize, because I don't really, like intellectually, I don't really believe it, but I know that it's deep in my soma, in my body, in my tissues, that in some way, shape, or form that I am superior to, right? So it's a multi-generational socialization process, a dehumanizing socialization process that for white folks, we have received ongoing messages that we've embodied, internalized, that we operate and function from, mostly unconscious, that has told us that we are superior or better than. For Black, Indigenous, people of color, not necessarily your belief, and yet there has been reinforcing messages and through your lived experiences that are trying to perpetuate a narrative of being less than or inferior to. So part of this work that deepens my understanding of why this is so critical is because I really have a much deeper understanding, again, speaking from the white-bodied experience, of what I have internalized, how that has shaped and informed how I make meaning of the world, how I perceive things, right? How I experience things, how it has informed my leadership professional practices, my learnings, how it's informing me as a parent, is really looking at what I've internalized from these systems that I didn't choose, but I was born into, right? I was born into. And so then we move to the interpersonal, and this is really talking about what is happening. And again, we all have, this is all within our sphere of influence, is what is happening between individuals or given groups of people. A term folks might be familiar with, microaggressions. Also not necessarily the hugest fan of that, because I believe any aggression is an aggression. There's nothing micro about it, particularly if they're happening over and over and over again. It has a major macro impact, right? But that's a lot of like, what are our relationships, right? When I look around, who am I primarily in relationship with? Do they look like me? Do they look like people outside of, what I look like? What are my relationships with my colleagues, my peers, my fellow classmates, my students? Like how, if I'm an administrator, how I interact, engage with colleagues, with, staff, with students, with the broader community, with our board, with our governing body, right? And so really looking at, this is very centered on relationships. And then I would say within this is also looking about what's the accountability within our institutions, right? That ensures that when harm gets caused, that repair and amending happens immediately. That's where we want to have urgency around. So that's a lot of like the interpersonal, what's happening within. Then we move to the institutional, and the institutional really is looking at policies, practices, procedures, cultural norms that are either upholding and maintaining the status quo or are really moving us forward in a direction towards, justice, equity, and I would say liberation, right? Where all people are really have the ability to be fully actualized and in their full humanness and beauty and divinity. So for some folks, not knowing who's where and who's what, you may feel like, I have no influence over policies, practices, and procedures. I'm a student, or I'm a this or a that. There are many ways to get involved. I know when I was in higher ed as a student, I organized, I got actively involved, I got curriculum changed, I held professors accountable. We instituted a whole lot of stuff where I didn't realize that I actually had that ability to influence in that way. So I think sometimes it's thinking creatively. And then lastly, structurally, what is happening between institutions and across sectors, right? So policies and laws and all over the place from all sectors that are inadvertently or advertently working together to maintain the status quo and uphold systems of oppression. So understanding that again, another big reason why we have to talk about this work, why we have to move beyond diversity and thinking of what we visually see, or moving beyond diversity and inclusion, is an understanding that oppression, marginalization, mistreatment, and a whole bunch of other stuff is happening. Like as we speak, it's happening. It's probably been happening a little bit in the Zoom room, right? It's happening where it's playing out at all of these levels. And so we have to be grounded in understanding. So some of the personal work is knowing what I've internalized, knowing my own biases, how that interacts, you know, in terms of my relationships with others, and then really calling into question the policies, practices, and procedures that we operate and function in, and who developed those policies, who's benefiting from those policies, who's being burdened by those policies. For the policies that these are designed for, did you have the voice of the people that these policies are intended for, you know, in these conversations? So this is all, there's a lot of why as to why we got to keep engaging in this conversation, and it doesn't stop. Some folks may have heard the term like equity lens. Like we, you know, with everything we do, we have to have like a DEI lens or an equity lens. And my beloved partner, Bernardo Ruiz, and I will say, he coined the term, and we say, no, an equity LASIK. What we want everyone to do is have an equity LASIK, because glasses I could take on and off, and particularly as a white body person, I could always choose to take them on and off. I am very new to the land of glasses, so I feel like now I'm looking really smart and sophisticated, but that's what happens when you approach 50 and eyes go a little, you know, don't see as well. But LASIK, I have not had it, but I heard it could be painful, but then it's amazing and it's permanent, right? So we want this to be like our everyday filter, waking moment, sleeping moment, but that whole, because I believe the equity LASIK will always keep us questioning. It will always keep us questioning. So just a few more slides, and then I'm going to pause and we're going to open it up for Q&A, because I want to just make sure one of the things that's critical for any given institution that is committed to engaging in this work, that you have a shared analysis and shared understanding of what we're talking about. There's 79 people. If we went around to all 79 and said, how do you define diversity, or how do you define inclusion, or how do you even define racism, we'd probably get 60 plus or 70 plus different definitions, or at least varying iterations of it. And it will be very difficult for us to do any kind of systemic change work and transformational change work if we're coming at it operating from different places. So having a set of working definitions is critical. And I say working, there's more than one. You have to come up with consensus agreement, you know, whatever your process is in terms of when we say diversity, what do we really mean? So a few slides that I'm just going to offer with some terms, just again to kind of think about. So Deanna, we can go to the next slide. And so part of this work, right, is bias. What do we mean by a bias? And so because so much of, you know, why we have to talk about this is because as human beings, we primarily operate from the unconscious. And the unconscious is driving attitudes, it's driving behaviors, and it's creating certain results. We take in, I think it's 11 million or 11 billion bits of information every day. There's some great science behind this. And a very, very small percentage of actually what we take in every second is conscious. We know that unconscious thought and action happens at the speed of light, while the conscious thought and expression is like at a slow pace, is moving, right? So when we're continually operating from that automatic pilot, or that number one question that gets asked when you join an institution for the first time and you're starting a new job, and we say, well, why is it done that way? And then the response is, well, you know, because we've always done it this way, right? We operate from these automatic places and we don't often question. And so part of our personal work that helps shape and frame the why is what are the explicit things I know I have some biases around, and then what might be unconscious or implicit, and how are we collectively engaging in these conversations? That has to be part of IIT's work, and any institution, is that we're engaging in conversation where we're normalizing conversations around our biases, and how is that impacting our stated vision, our stated commitments, our stated goals for our students, and the outcomes that we want to see. So next slide. And so diversity, and I love, Deanna, that you said it. And yes, when I mean, I couldn't see all the faces, but when folks had, their cameras on for a moment, and then for those who have, photos up, you can see that there looks like tremendous representation compared to, let's say, where I'm living right now. And often what happens is we stop here because we think that this is enough. Well, if we have Black people here, if we have, Indigenous, if we have Latinx community here, or if we have, you can add in other marginalized and oppressed identities, like, isn't that enough? Like, isn't that a good job? Isn't that what we're working towards? And having representation is important because everybody deserves access and opportunity. Like, nobody should be denied any form of access to a life to thrive. It's like a God-given, you don't believe in God, like it's a human right. But not everyone necessarily gets those rights and privileges. And so it's critical, but it's not enough. So you may be doing a great job, and you even want to think about greater outreach, but then you want to look at who's in the leadership roles. If we really break down student body, if we look at across technology fields, who mostly makes up those fields, particularly when you get into the leadership roles? Thinking about pay, thinking about, right? So there's a lot more that we have to be thinking about than just like an immediate representation at what's at the surface and we visibly see. So if we go to the next slide, inclusion, I think a key piece when we talk about inclusion, because we'll say, look, everyone's here, everyone can contribute, but often what happens is we'll invite everyone in and we see great representation, and it's an unspoken truth, but that what we're asking people is to quickly assimilate to the cultural norms that continue to center white bodies and often men and cisgendered men, right, in varying leadership roles. And so what we're saying to be truly inclusive is we have to shift some of our norms to ensure that we are centering the leadership, the decision-making, the voices, the influence of Black, Indigenous people of color, and that it's not just the representation. And then if we move to the next slide with equity, again, we're really talking about when it comes to equity, we're looking at policies and practices that are driving outcomes. And so if we go to the next slide, we're going to kind of further explain. And again, these are working definitions. And again, just to give some context, when we're talking about racial equity, one of the main pieces, there's kind of two pieces to it, but one of the main pieces is that where race can no longer be a predictor for one's success. Race could no longer be a predictor for one's success, right? And in that case, we're improving outcomes for all, for everyone, right? And really being able to center communities of color and to really transform policies, institutions, structures to ensure that what we do, how we operate and function is working towards race no longer being a predictor for someone's lived experiences and outcomes. And you can relate that in the context of education or in your professional sphere, or whatever that may be, right? So kind of having even some deeper understanding of these terms for me has helped me like, oh, wait a second. You're saying diversity isn't just this, it's all of this. Oh, you're saying equity means all of this. And then I have to think, well, why would we be talking about, the only reason why we'd be talking about equity, that must mean that there are a whole bunch of inequities that exist. And so that means we have a responsibility and a duty to really engage in the conversations around equity, because we have a knowing that so many inequities exist, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So with that, we can go to the next slide. I'm gonna open it up. Feel free to ask me personal questions if you want, or just like Ben asked, some broader questions. And so this is really a time we have like a good, half an hour or so left Just again, and we can, pause for a moment if people want to ground, but what questions are you holding? What have you been sitting with that maybe you want to explore more? Thank you for closing the slide deck, because I was going to ask for us to do that. So great. And it's beautiful to see a lot of faces. And so this is really a time for conversation, for discussion, for questions. And if somebody asks a question and there's somebody in the group that says, hey, I would like to respond to that question, let's bring in the cross-pollination and collective learning that is here. And so we open it up.
I think while people are still talking or thinking of their questions, I kind of want to have you touch on a little bit more of what that looks like. When you bring people, when you talk about being inclusive and you bring people in the room, that you have a room that you consider diverse, I think we don't talk enough about that expectation that sometimes is put on people of color. Now I have to represent this whole group, or I'm the only Black woman in the room, so therefore.
Yep. So now you got to speak.
Now we're diverse.
Yep. No, that's real.
Now I
that's
explain
real.
it for everything. And also the part B to that is I'm seeing a trend, is that it's somehow my responsibility as a Black person or a person of color to solve this, to know where, this is how you fix it. And I can tell you, I can make some recommendations, but the pressure on that to do that is very stressful. One, because I've been accused of not being a team player. I've been accused of not loving IIT or not, wanting to support IIT because I'm critical of things that they're doing. So I just wanted people to be aware of that. Like, just because you have a Black person in a room, one, that's not enough, as you said beautifully, by the way, thank you. Two, you be mindful. I can't fix this because I didn't create this. So
absolutely,
we have to be really thoughtful in how we do things, and really it's that conversation. And this isn't gonna go away tomorrow or the next day after that. This is something that we are constantly going to have to work on. And there's no gold star in racism. I say this all the time. I have not met a white person who completely gets it. I do not know a white person that is ahead of everybody else. I do not know, I don't subscribe to I'm a social justice warrior. I don't know what that means. I don't know who created it. This is something that we live and breathe and work every day.
Yeah, Peter, and I will come back to that, Deanna. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, first of all, Tammy, thanks so much for coming and sharing with us. I've heard many of these concepts before, but I always come away from these conversations feeling that I get it just a little bit more.
Yep.
And to be honest with you, it's hard as a largely dominant person, white male, highly educated, I check so many of those boxes. It's hard not to feel really guilty about having all this privilege and I don't want to feel guilty. I want to feel empowered to do something about it. I don't want to feel guilty. I want to feel like, okay, I'm going to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And one of the challenges we have in higher ed, and I know, you probably know this as well as anybody, is that, one of the things you said about equity and access was you've solved the equity problem when being a particular race means you have an equal opportunity and an equal chance of being the leader. And yet, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that this is a many decades problem because,
centuries.
Well, it's centuries in the making, and it may be decades in the solving. And the reason it may be decades in the solving is because there are deep, deep social structures that have led us to where we are. So for
Yes.
example, the number of African American physics PhDs is a tiny number.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, they're so underrepresented relative to the population that the prospects of hiring tenured African American physics faculty and then professors and then full professors and then department chairs, whatever. So I guess my question is, how do we tackle,
Mhm.
how do we, and I've certainly known about this problem for decades because the NSF publishes numbers on this. And it's always occurred to me, okay, that we have to work to bring awareness about this and opportunity to
Absolutely.
learn, and
Absolutely.
STEM awareness in the high schools, and in high schools where students maybe don't have an understanding of this, go back into the middle schools and the primary schools. But as a university educator and administrator, as you begin to assay the problem, the challenge, and ask, what can I do? We start to feel a little bit helpless, like, well, this is a
Yep.
drop in the
Yep.
bucket. And,
Yep.
and what difference am I going to make? And I only say, I don't say that because I'm giving up or anything. I say that because this is a
The struggle.
challenge. And so I'm just wondering if you have some
Yes.
advice for us.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's well, I can offer some of my own experience and perspective on this. So I want to, Peter, so I'm going to pause for a moment because there was so much that you said there, and I want to just acknowledge, Deanna, what you had brought forward as well around, when we get into these, like, we come into a meeting room, we have a department meeting, we have a lecture series, we have this, but we come into these rooms. Often there's can be greater representation of white folks, particularly once we get higher up in leadership levels. A big piece, and then also naming, like, how often we can put a tremendous amount of burden on particularly Black and Indigenous and people of color in the room to either be the spokesperson, to have all the answers, and even tokenized by centering their voice or experience, but the follow through after that gets lost, right? So it becomes a momentary, we're showing, we just like, look, see, Deanna, we welcomed your voice in, but then what happens once you leave the meeting room, that it really just becomes a tokenizing act. And so for my white body folks in the room, my white community that's here, we really have to look at the ways we've been socialized, indoctrinated, our belief systems, our biases around how we operate and function, and how much space we actually take up when we come into these rooms. What are the beliefs we hold around professionalism? What are the beliefs we hold around who actually has the skill set, knowledge base, ability to be a contributing member in this moment, right? I have to do a lot. You could already tell. I mean, some of it's like my Jewish New Yorker, but like I could talk all day, all night. I'm a talker and I'm an extreme extrovert. Just by going into a room, I automatically take up a whole bunch of space. So part of my practice has been having to try to sit more, listen more, and be really intentional when I speak, particularly when there's the opportunity to be taking, the lead from Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So part of our work is just constantly doing the why of ourselves. Why do I think this way? Why did I show up this way? Why did I act this way? Why am I making the decision this way? Why did I react, respond in this way? Why did I, why am I feeling what I'm feeling, particularly getting into the body and the feelings? And so I want to lift up, one of the things that any given institution really needs to do is to think about, what are the cultural norms in which we operate and function in, and who's benefiting from those norms and who gets burdened by those norms. Right? I know the word white supremacy is very loaded and charged, and I'm going to offer as a resource the work of Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones, White Supremacy Cultural Norms, because it is really the way they categorize the cultural norms that exist within all given institutions and framing, it's been such a incredible tool for me because it has me question everything and try to identify the ways in which, you know, that is showing up. So I want to acknowledge we got to really think about what are the cultural norms, and then how are we truly centering the voices of, not in a tokenizing or burdening way, but in a way that's in like true partnership collaboration that honors, values, and dignifies for our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color that are in the rooms with us. So Peter, I was about to say Patrick, Peter, and then I see a couple more hands. So there is a lot that you said. So I want to start with the guilt piece. So there's a saying, what resists persists. If I resist, like, and try to push away and run away from like the guilt that I'm feeling, I guarantee you it's going to build up and keep hanging on and be this like lingering pest that you're trying to get away, but it just keeps coming on. If you actually research and do some work around racial identity theory, some of the racial identity theory for white body, what it literally says, a phase that white folks who are on this journey that are going to go through is being steeped in guilt. Not a bad thing. I should feel guilty in some levels. I should feel some shame on some levels. I should feel some embarrassment on some, because that means I'm coming to the realization of how I have benefited from an unjust system simply because of the color of my skin, and I happen to be born at this time, you know, in this lifetime, in this country, in this way, right? And so the main thing is, let yourself feel the guilt, cry over it, scream over it, get with your other white peers, talk about it with each other, but we don't stay there, right? Use that to say, I'm feeling guilt because I'm realizing that we are in an unjust world, an unjust environment, and I am going to use that and my power and privilege that I hold with that to actually be part of transforming society, right? And so use the guilt, use the shame, use those other feelings, not to stay stuck in, but for the benefit of others. And then the thing around, I mean, we could do like hours and retreats and strategizing. And Peter, I'm happy to have some, you know, additional conversation offline. You know, it's the same story again and again. Like, well, we put the job description out there. We even say in our job description, you know, we encourage, you know, XYZ to apply, or we, you know, we even use like, you know, more inclusive language or all these things. We know that it's not enough, right? What are all of, and again, thinking about what you have influence over, what are all the barriers for Black, Indigenous, people of color to come into these, you know, specific fields, right? And to these specific degrees and programs and things like that. How are we perpetuating these barriers? How can we potentially remove these barriers? What pipelines we can create, not the prison to pipe, you know, the school to prison pipeline, but the healthy pipeline, where I've seen some incredible work of higher institutions that are partnering with all of the local, like, public schools and high schools and even middle schools to create these incredible pipelines, because they're working extra hard to get more educators of color in the classrooms so that there's greater representation. And so some of, Peter, your work and the team's work really is going to be around identifying what barriers have we created. You got to do a deep analysis on policies, practices, and procedures. You got to think about relationships. How are we building intentional relationships? Like, what are the creative means that are out there to, you know, who says we can't? Because so often, because we don't question, we think we can't do something. But let me tell you, there are a lot of ways to get creative without completely going against a given policy or guideline or procedure, right? So you got to think creatively, you got to think outside the box that we've all been boxed into. And we've got to build intentional relationships, particularly with Black, Indigenous, people of color, to have a greater understanding of, like, why they're not coming into this field, or having them, you know, that conversation. Why would they want to? Why would anyone want to? I don't see myself represented there. I don't see myself having, you know, access to that. So a lot of relationship building, a lot of getting creative, and a lot of deep analysis and assessment of our own internal functioning to see what's contributing to the barriers of that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it correctly. Is it Jamshid?
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much. Thank
great.
you for a very interesting talk. I really appreciate it. I have an observation and I have a related question. My observation is that the past some 40, 45 years that I have been living in one of the suburbs of Chicago, I have seen quite a bit of change. You know, I was talking with my daughter the other day, and she said that, Dad, remember that when I was in elementary school, I would hide my, you know, place of my origin, when my ancestors coming from another country in the Middle East. But now to a point that my school system is inviting me to come back and talk about my heritage. So there's quite a bit of change I have observed
Absolutely.
personally. So my related question is, I know that this probably depends on local to area, but have you
Yeah.
seen the same trend, or what is your observation on that? Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for acknowledging. So there's lots of changes we see in community, some of that are really good and healthy, and some that are unhealthy, like gentrification and other things. You know, we have come a long way. I mean, we're here together in this room, in this space at this time. You know, we have definitely come a long way. I would say, you know, it's a mix, and it does depend, you know, city to city, state to state, you know, in terms of you know, kind of where we're at, particularly in this current, you know, socio-political climate. I do think that what we're also seeing, I really want to lift up our younger generations that I think are actively organizing and raising their voices, that are also calling us in, and us meaning like I'm you know, almost 50, I'm just shy of being 50, people are elders, right, are calling us in ways to say, we want something different. We want to be, you know, recognized in our full humanity and all of who we are, not some binary way of being or thinking or prescribing. So I think our younger generations, I think that because, you know, it's more at the forefront of conversations, that you have some areas, some communities that are making a stated commitment to say, we are going to address systemic racism. We are going to be culturally responsive in our educational context, and ensure cultural relevancy for all of our students and learning. So hence getting invited in to share your story, to share about your culture, right? So that our chosen pedagogy curriculum and things like that are contextual to all lives, not just a handful of lives. So definitely seeing that, and we've still got a long way to go in that work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, Marsha, that's real. We had an election yesterday and outcomes today, and we know now in certain areas. Yeah, I mean, critical race theory, and the irony of it, but I mean, I understand why, but really, like, the tenets and the premise of critical race theory is literally to achieve social justice. It is literally about the humanizing of all given people, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So yes, it's
Hey, Tammy, can I cut
yeah,
in for a second?
please.
Marsha asked a question for about how do we get people in the room that need to hear this. It feels like we're preaching to the choir, and my thought on that is that I'm sure we all might know people who can benefit from hearing these topics. But my goal and my position, and I'll always keep this position, is that I think I need to work on myself. I think constantly showing up to conversations like this, I don't think you can preach to a choir because there's nothing to get. So again, you cannot get this. This is not something you can check off and say, I understand it, I get it. It's a red flag to me anytime someone says, I understand this, I get it. No, that means you're trying to talk over it. That means you're uncomfortable with it, and you're trying to rush and get this off your plate because it's uncomfortable. So anytime someone tells me, oh, we need to have so-and-so in the room, or they need to come in. No, I think people will come. I want people to come when they're ready. Now, I looked at the registration list, and we do RSVPs for a reason, because I want to see who shows up. And yes, there are people like, all right, okay. You can't do this authentically if you don't come when you're ready. I can't force anybody to do this. If you've ever tried to do a diet just to do a diet, I was hiding cookies in my car. So you can't force this. You can have conversations and be like, hey, what just happened? Let me tell you how I feel or what this brought up for me. Yes, you can continue to have your personal relationships, but I will never force anybody because that is pointless. You can use yourself. I hope that when you how Cami was talking about our power and what we can do, I hope that people will use this and say, hey, I went to this, I learned something. Maybe there's another one, and there is another one next week. I brought Tammy back. I love her that much. I asked her to do it twice, to come next week and talk. And use your power and influence this way if you want to help. But just going around pointing fingers, hey, there's some people out there that need to get in the room. That is not helping us. That is not as causing harm. That's making people more defensive. And there is no choir to preach to because all of us need to learn something new. I took away something today. We all need a reset. We all need to understand why we're talking about diversity. We all need to understand what it means, what it looks like, what it feels like. So we all have constant work to do. Some may have more than others. I understand we're all coming from a different place of it. But I don't want to get in this place where we're saying, you know, it's the same people that show up in the room. Well, then it's the same people that show up. We're going to still have this conversation. So that's my answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah, and Zach and Ben, I'm going to come to you, and then I see also another question in the chat room. Just to briefly speak to that, and my apologies if I'm missing anything in the chat room. Sometimes it can be challenging to do a simultaneous like facilitation and chat. Marsha, I appreciate that question. Deanna, I love that piece also around like, you know, always, you know, keeping a focus on self. I will say, so when you look at change management theory, there's a piece around where it's, you know, you got 20% who are like the early adopters, like, yes, like racial justice, Black Lives Matter, like we're, you know, they're like all, and then you have like, you know, it's like another, or maybe 30%, let's say 40%, something like that. Then you have like another, let's say 60%, right? I'm not 100% on the numbers. Let's say a 60% that are kind of like, I think so, I'm not really sure, like they're kind of somewhere in there. And then there's the 20% who like this lifetime, I won't even bother with. I know they're not going to change. I know they're not interested, and it's not where I'm going to put my energy. So Marsha, what I appreciate about your question and for this institution to look at is how are we ensuring that people have the opportunity and access to be able to develop their knowledge base, the application of it, the integration of it, and what are we as an institution, like, you know, doing in terms of who we are culturally, our policies, like what we really stand for. Because the truth of the matter is when an institution really like is like, no, we are a commitment to, like, you know, you can join us and be part of this family, or maybe we're not the right family and you can go somewhere else. Yes, Marsha. And so like institutionally, what are we doing to ensure that like everyone who is a part of this institution as Beyond is clear on who we are and where we stand? How does it show up in policy, practice, and procedures? How does it show up in who we are? How does it show up when we operate and function in our relationships that will hold folks accountable? Because Deanna, you're right, we can't force anyone. We can't make someone come, you know, to drink the water. It's like, you know, right? Or whatever, the horse, the whatever you teach you. But there are a lot of things that we can do that honestly, people will be able to either determine like, I'm going to stay part of and be a part of, and then we grow to like, you know, maybe 80%, and the 20% that are just never going to change, and maybe this isn't their family and community for them anymore. But it also with this, Marsha, it's like, these are great, and it goes like so beyond. So I'm going to actually invite Marsha in because now I see your hand up, and then Zach and Ben will wrap up with the two of you.
Yeah, and first I'm going to apologize for not for not turning on my camera, but I'm in the process of trying to get down to the law school. And I just wanted to add, and thank you for your clarification. And Deanna, I hear what you're saying. My point is not about forcing people. You can't force people to do anything. But in order to make change in any organization, you have to reach people in some way. And what I've noticed is sometimes people don't come to diversity related workshops because they don't don't think it's for them. They think it's for the others, the people who are diverse. And so oftentimes, I know at least I'll speak for the law school, we lose people because they don't think it's for them. And so my question is, how do we start to get people to understand that this is about all of us and all of us coming in to hear this? And yes, and then there's another part to it. People who do diversity work, like I do day in and day out, are on burnout. Right. And so you get tired of coming and hearing and speaking and talking the same thing over and over again. There is a high rate of turnover among diversity professionals right now because people talk and talk, people listen, people feel sad, and they go back and they do nothing. And it's burnout. And so that's where I'm trying. How do we keep our people doing this work motivated, energized, and continuing to move, especially in this time right now where we have people fighting against, and it's not even critical race theory, it's just history, it's factual, and we don't even want to talk about it. So I don't mean to go too far into it, but I want to be clear that I'm not into forcing people. I just will withdraw and make impact where I can, which is what I do. So I just wanted to clarify.
Oh, Marsha, I'm so glad that you spoke. And I'm glad that you have, I always appreciate when people put their photo because I feel like I get to make a little bit more of a human connection. So there's a few things that I heard, Marsha, in what you're saying. And one of the things that I would ask as an institution, particularly leaders in this institution, how do you ensure the well-being, particularly of your Black, Indigenous, and people of color, like faculty, leadership, so on and so forth? This is not like, I love, so, and in the next session, I'm actually going to show a little video clip of Dr. Bettina Love, who I absolutely love, and it is worth a watch. But we'll often say, in this piece, Dr. Bettina Love, talks about how, like, I didn't make this mess. Like, I'm not, I shouldn't be responsible, like in the sense of, so everyone has a role to play. And yet I would say folks who really needed to be leaning in and doing this work are folks who racially identify as white. And there is a bigger undertaking that we have to take. And part of why I believe that is to actually ensure the well-being of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who like live and breathe this every day. There's no like option of turning it off, or this is like who folks are as individuals and communities. And so I think there's just a lot of conversations that the institution is going to have around what truly is our commitment. What are our values? How are we resourcing this work? How are we putting it at the forefront? How is that going to show up in, again, across policies, practice, and procedures throughout the institution and every aspect of the institution? How do we ensure healing and well-being, particularly for those most impacted by the inequities and outcomes that we're seeing? And those are all questions now the institution really has to sit with and to really think strategically, how do we ensure that this is getting out everywhere and everyone who is going to be part of this family of IIT sees themselves in this work? So yeah. So Zach, we have a few more minutes, and okay. Thank you everyone who shared this far.
So, and what you were just saying kind of comes to the question I really have, which is, this meeting is sort of a little bit about the why, and the next one will be a little bit about the how. Mm-hmm. So far, we've talked about the why in a very broad brush sense of history and this country, and really worldwide. I don't think it's isolated this country in any way. Mm-hmm. But I think to actually be successful, you have to understand the why locally. Yep. And I think that's, how do we get to that point? Because if we don't first identify what the actual things we're trying to solve directly, we can't formulate the policies to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in our own actual community, what is it we're trying to address, and how do we identify those things?
Yeah, well, I think you're trying to address the inequities, the harm, the marginalization, the mistreatment, just again, what continues to oppress and marginalize given groups of people. And I think, like,
right, first you have to demonstrate that has happened here. And then that's actually that's the thing I want to, that's a subtle point, but I think it's important, because while I understand this in a broad sense, in my own personal experience, I have not experienced many of these things in my own interactions.
Mhm.
And so I want to be able to understand where these things are occurring so that we
Yep,
can
yep.
address them.
Yep, absolutely. And so Zach, a lot of how that gets done is through, organizational assessments, environmental scans, looking at like really, collecting the narratives, the data, having procedural guidelines on how these things get addressed when they do show up, really centering the stories and narratives of those who are most impacted and always keeping those at the forefront, being in relationship with people enough that we can understand like their lived experience. And here's the thing, another thing I absolutely love, Ijeoma Oluo, who wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, another fantastic book. In the book, basically says, if a Black, Indigenous, or person of color tells you they've been harmed or that something is racist, then believe him, it is. And to me, that's like as simple as it is. Not complex, not, but what I really appreciate in the humility, Zach, of you bringing this forward is that you're not alone. I hear it again and again, particularly for white folks or people in varying leadership roles, or, where it's like, I hear you, but I don't see it. I don't know from it. So help me better understand, or like show me the data, or show me, what's happening really here in our context. So then I could try to do something about it. And so I think a lot of what has to happen within institutions and organizations is really, if you are going to prioritize that, then what's the data that's going to support us, and then what are the procedural guidelines and policies that ensure that we act and respond with urgency if something is brought forward, so that and that there's greater transparency, because usually often things go unspoken or brushed under the rug. We don't really talk about it. So yeah. And then I'm just gonna Ben, I'm gonna have you jump in, and then I see a few things in the chat room also.
Okay, great. I'll make it quick. I didn't realize it was so late, and we have the heater guy in here, so it's like, I thought to myself, what is it like being a victim of racism? And my question is, I think the closest I've come to it is the last couple of years with the hostility towards immigration, because it finally dawned on me, and to remind myself that my father's an immigrant. He came from Italy. I'm Italian. But it seemed like there was this hatred or environment of, they don't even know these people yet. They're in the other countries. Is that similar? Mm-hmm. I mean, that really made me angry, thinking that they don't like immigrants. I mean, it's hostile towards immigrants. If it was, and my own father was from another country, what would that have meant for me if there was that much hostility years ago? Where, well, we just don't want you over here. We know nothing about you, but to stay there. Is that?
Yeah, no, Ben, I really appreciate that question. I would say similar but different. Similar in the sense of I've had lived experiences based on certain aspects of my identities where I've experienced hatred, I've experienced harm, and traumatization based on aspects of my identity, right? And that gives me an anchoring or a knowing what the impact of hatred, oppression, all, whatever it may be, could have on a person or a given community. I have greater empathy, and I have some sensing or knowing. And I always say, I may be Jewish, but I'm white. I may be this, but I'm white. So I can't really ever understand the lived experience of, many of my actually family members now who are Black, Indigenous, people of color that don't look like me, won't experience life in the way I do. So there's a potential element of understanding, but I have to be really careful to not then try to relate my experience to a Black, Indigenous, or person of color's experience, because that often, in more cases than not, is going to cause more harm, because it's not the same, but there is a correlation or connection point, because oppression is oppression and the impact of it is the impact of it. So yeah, but it definitely gives an anchoring of like, oh, wait a second, I have this lived experience that might be help me to understand what we're talking about that much more. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you. And then we have just a few minutes left. So Margaret, and then I'm gonna just say a few closing things, and then Deanna, I'll turn it back to you. And thank you for those
Okay.
being able to stay
Thanks
on.
so much, Tammy. I'll
Yeah.
make it quick, but what a great presentation. I mean,
Mm.
thought-provoking. I'm just all over the place, but I had a great experience. I got my master's at IIT, and 20 years ago, the faculty person asked us to write an autobiography. And this was really, he was ahead of his time, and he forced you to strip down, you know, look at your race, look at your culture, look at your ethnicity. Why is your story what it is? And trying to have this objective look at yourself and your story. And I just thought that was fabulous. But and really it was eye-opening for me. But education, and also your slide about elitism, of course, maybe because I'm an IIT alum. But we tend to, I get so frustrated with people who, as you say, are still debating this point. I mean, let's go. But people just are afraid to look at it, as you say, white people, and just let go of some of that power. I had a great experience as a staff person here, multiculturalism. My son is now leading his diversity team at on his high school administrative team. But education is key. In the primary, I mean, in pre-K, whenever we finally formalize education, we have to teach these kids, and there's such a struggle to acknowledge that this is where this has to happen. These are just facts. There's nothing oppressive or nothing threatening about it. But anyway, great presentation, and hopefully we can break through at some point.
Yeah, and Margaret, I appreciate what you're saying. A couple things I just want to respond, and then I just want to express deep gratitude to everyone, and the opportunity is not only do we need to educate, you know, our children and young people and those in which we're serving that are coming into our classrooms, but if we are not doing the personal work alongside everything we're doing to support others, is critical, right? Like I cannot transform a system if I'm not transforming myself.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's where I appreciate, Deanna, when you brought it forward, and just the importance of really being anchored in some kind of, you know, discipline practice that allows you to continually grow and evolve in this work, and to, you know, continue to support others in their learning and growing. And there was something else, but I can't
remember. If I could add one point too, I'm breaking your train of thought, but even as the organization is critical, but maybe IIT, I'm a grandma now, but maybe even teach parenting. You know, get our staff and faculty and open your mind to what are you showing your kids at home? What kind of attitudes do you have that you're not even aware of? Because that's where children learn a large part of who they are and their attitudes. So even just at a personal level, how can we really go the grassroots on this?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I know we are at time. I know Amber, you be still my heart, because Amber was just like, okay, we've been talking about this for an hour and a half. Someone tell me what's next.
And that's literally for leadership. That's leadership.
Yeah.
I see quite a few people that are department heads and leaders, and I appreciate the response, but there's other stuff. And I think one of the things to kind of talk about, I think what Zach said, is talking to the indigenous people of color, really getting stories, because there's stuff that happens at IIT every day that people are unaware of.
Yes. Amber, I'm so glad you came on. And that goes to, what Zach was saying, what I'm saying, honestly, it's if time is not taken. But the other piece that I want to say, I've seen this again and again, where institutions will listen to the stories, but then they do nothing to respond and act to it. So without action, don't put the burden on re-traumatizing Black, Indigenous, and people of color to tell their story about how they've been harmed. Know they've been harmed. You don't actually even need the data. Know that they've been harmed. White folks, we get to do our work and look at historically, present day, all the ways Black, Indigenous, people of color get harmed. Trust that it's probably happening in our institution, and then think about moving forward. How do we want to ensure that that isn't happening, even if we don't 100% know for sure, but most likely it's happening. So we want to make sure. So I love an invitation and call in for leadership. I always appreciate that. And also just want to acknowledge, and it was privately messaged, and this is how, like, even me, ableism plays out. I think I was all anxious and excited that I forgot to request to ensure that we had the subtitles and transcripts available. So we will ensure next time, we'll try to make sure that is available. So just appreciate you all. So I'm grateful. I hope you come back next week. Deanna has my email. So, you know, and also just to my, particularly any white women in the room, a big part, which I didn't talk about, of the work that I do is actually transformational executive coaching, primarily with white women, so that we could really heal from internalized racial superiority and sexism and show up effectively in this work. And so I'm just thrilled to have this opportunity and look forward to seeing, you know, if not all, most of you next week. And thank you, Deanna, and to Peter and to IIT. So Deanna here.
Hey everyone, I know everyone's gonna pop off because it's 1:30. I want to thank you all. As Cami said, she will be here next week. And I just, on November 15th, for the month of November, the book is What's Up with White Women, Unpacking Sexism and Racism. And so the authors are actually not coming virtually on the 15th to talk about their book. So I'll have that. Yeah, that's
I love it. And one of their dear friends of mine, and Tillman Smith, who's one of the authors. We are, well, Tillman, one of the, yep. So Tillman and I are launching in January, actually, a group coaching series for white women in varying leadership and managerial roles. So we'll share that information with you.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so I will have that up so people can sign up for that. I think that's going to be another great conversation. And the book, I'm looking forward to. Mine's coming in through Amazon shortly, so I'm excited to read it. So I'm asking all of you, please stay engaged. Please join the book club. Please continue to come in and having these sessions with us. Peter's in the room, and I think we're going to continue this speaker series. If you enjoyed this and this was beneficial to you, you can email me. You can definitely email Peter, since he's my partner in crime on this. So, and let us know that you enjoyed them and they were beneficial, so we can keep it going. Thank you all. We'll see you next week. If you haven't signed up, please join us if you can. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all. Appreciate you. Have a blessed day.